tycker jag att vi kör. Hej och varmt välkomna till Socialdemokraternas årliga ekonomisk-politiska seminarium i Almedalen som i år har temat Kostnadskrisen i människors vardag. And I will take the rest in English since we have some honored English guests. Since the pandemic and the war on Ukraine, inflation has surged all across the globe and also in Sweden. And this has created a cost of living crisis and a real squeeze for households that are pressed both by these rising prices and rising interest rates, which in turn also are creating financial instabilities. And even as inflation looks like it's coming down, there are a lot of insecurities, and we might want to look more at the weather forecasts rather than the central bank forecast to really know how the prices are going to develop. And this obviously raises the question of the state, and in particular fiscal policy. What could fiscal policy do to counter this cost of living crisis? What could have been done and what could be done in the future? And this is what we will discuss here today. My name is Elinor Odeberg, and I will be the moderator of today's conversation. I am the chief economist at Arena Idé, which is the progressive think tank here in Sweden. And with me I have Marcus Roberts, who is chief of public data at YouGov, and Laura Hartman, who is chief economist at the Swedish Trade Union Confederation, that will shed light on the material conditions of blue-collar workers. And they are also the hosts of today's event. These locals are theirs. And then, of course, Mikael Damberg, former finance minister and economic spokespersons for the Social Democrats. And you will be first up on stage to give a few warm welcoming minutes before we go to the panelist discussion.
Thank you. Thank you very much, and welcome everyone. This past year and a half has been exceptional. Actually, the past 3.5 years have been, if not unprecedented, so at least very unusual. The global pandemic revealed vulnerabilities in the trade and supply chains, putting international collaboration and trust to a test. All over the world, governments made unprecedented efforts to combat the deadly virus, as well as the threat of the economic collapse. When everyone thought that things were looking up, war broke out in the center of Europe for the first time since World War II. The Ukrainians are courageous, defending their country and our European values against Russia's awful and illegal invasion. Thankfully, Europe has successfully come together as one voice, supporting Ukraine, supporting democracy, freedom, and our right to live in peace in Europe. These events have encouraged economists and policymakers to explore new avenues of reasoning and operating, keeping the wheels turning while limiting human interactions, as was the case during the pandemic, or battling inflation while facing recession, which has been the primary economic task in Europe and the US for the past year and a half, has forced us to reconsider old truths and sometimes embrace new ones. But it's neither economists or policymakers who are in the center of this new reality. It's people. It's the single mom who struggles to make ends meet, and the price of food has increased by 20%. It is the retired couple who can't afford to pay their train tickets to visit their grandchildren any longer. It is the construction worker who has woken up in the middle of the night for the past 10 years to get to work and now finds the electricity bill has surged while someone else is making huge profits. As politicians, it's the people that we serve. And this year's economic seminar is all about people. How the cost of living crisis has affected everyday lives of ordinary people, and what they expect from their elected officials in terms of handling the crisis and meeting their needs in this economic environment. It's a privilege of mine, being a member of parliament, getting to spend a lot of time traveling around the country, meeting people who share their stories with me. But today I have invited two guests who, in their respective fields, have devoted their professional lives to channel and elevate the voices of the many. Laura Hartman, chief economist of LO, has more closely than perhaps anyone studied the changes of the hard economic reality of working people and ordinary families in Sweden over the last couple of years. I also want to give a warm welcome to our international guest this year, Marcus Roberts, chief of public data at YouGov. With a very long experience collecting and analyzing data and policy preferences of people across the globe. So Mr. Robert is an unmatched expert on the subject. So please give them both a warm applause and welcome to the seminar.
Thank you, Mikael. And first we will have Marcus to shed some light on the household's expectations. Laura, of course, to give your presentation, and then we will have Marcus, and then we will go to a panel discussions. And if you have questions, spare them. If we have time, we will have one or two questions posed by the audience at the end of the seminar.
Thank you very much. And in a true spirit of a Swedish-British friendship, I promised our guest here an opportunity to learn some Swedish. So I will now turn to Swedish. Tack så hemskt mycket för inbjudan. Jag kommer att ha med mig några bilder. Och här ser ni att igår gick jag in i min Almedalsbubbla. Klockan stannade till 27 juni, det är faktiskt 28 idag. Men jag hoppas att det är sista felet i den här presentationen. Resten kan ni lita på. Krisen och arbetarna. Det har inte undkommit någon att den här krisen har slagit rätt hårt mot hushållen. Och vi vet att de som har de relativt sett lägre marginalerna brukar vara de som drabbar hårdast. Så att där har ni liksom mitt grundresultat. Men jag tänkte illustrera detta med några bilder. Agendan för denna korta presentation är följande. Hur har svenska arbetarhushåll drabbats och vad borde man göra åt detta? Och jag tänker att den sista frågan så kommer jag bara lite påbörja och sen får paneldiskussionen ta oss vidare. Här tar vi lite fakta först, sen får ni lite siffror allt eftersom. Vi har haft en Alvesta-familj som har följt med oss, eller vi har följt den här Alvesta-familjen sen i höstas, hur ekonomin har sett ut. Och varför vi har valt just Alvesta är att det råkar vara det elområde som har drabbats hårdast. Vi har en motsvarighet även i Gällivare och så har vi en ensamstående mamma med dotter i Stockholms förort och några andra personer till. Men Alvesta-familjen har blivit den liksom tydligaste illustrationen. Ni kan läsa där fakta om hur vi räknar. Vi utgår från genomsnittsinkomster för en LO-familj med en heltidsarbetande förälder i industrin, en deltidsarbetande i kommunal. Ni får själv bestämma vem som är vem i familjen. Och så har man 2 barn och villa och vovve, det vet jag inte. Det vovven vet jag inte om man har, men övrigt ser ni där. Och sen så tar vi utgifter för det nödvändigaste som Konsumentverket fastslår. Och så tittar vi vad finns kvar i plånboken efter de nödvändiga kostnaderna. Jag vill understryka, de nödvändiga innehåller inte nya fotbollsskor, inte presenter till barnens kompisar eller barnen för den delen heller, inte heller tandläkarkostnader. Ni vet, inget lullilull överhuvudtaget. Och inte mycket av det andra heller, så att det är nödvändigt. Okej, om vi börjar då här. Kommer jag inte ihåg exakt vilken månad det ser ni. Men det här är 2021, någon gång månad är inte fastställt. Men innan inflationen drog igång så ser vi att vi har ändå rätt en del kvar i plånboken för allt det här från tandläkaren till barnens presenter och annat. Men så tar vi den enskilt värsta månaden, december 2022, när elpriserna var som högst, när förbrukningen också var som störst. Så ser ni vad som hände. Siffran lyser rött. Minus drygt 6 000. Var tar man det ifrån? Sparkontot. Man kanske låter några rum vara kalla. Man anpassar så gott man kan. Det ser vi också i konsumtionsstatistiken att den började störtdyka i volymer. Man har anpassat sig till det yttersta för att klara av de här minusmånaderna. Sen när det är någonstans på vårkanten, när priserna börjar stabiliseras, så börjar man krypa uppåt. För att nu, det senaste mätningen då, där också el och värme konsumtionen har minskats av naturliga skäl när det är varmare tider, så har vi kommit upp över vattenytan igen. Skönt, ja. Men någonstans finns det här underskottet ackumulerat. Sparkontot är tomt. Kanske har man lånat av släkt och vänner och så vidare. Så läget är inte på något sätt under kontroll för väldigt många fortfarande. Okej. Så kommer lite nya växande siffror här. Om vi tittar vad som har hänt under den här perioden. Men här ser jag ju mina egna bilder, herregud. Mitt framför mig. Bensinpriserna har ju gått upp under tiden, men nu till maj återigen kommit ner. Så det ser faktiskt ganska ljust ut relativt vintern, men plus 23% fortfarande. Elpriserna, då tar vi elområde 3 här. Ni ser toppen är så högt upp så den inte ens ryms med i bilden. Men fortfarande ligger vi ju på högre nivåer än vad vi gjorde genomsnitt 2019. Fast det är mycket bättre läge nu än tidigare. Livsmedel, någonting har hänt med det här upptäcker jag också. Här kommer andra felet jag bjuder på. Vi har inga siffror, och dessutom ser den så här förrädisk platt ut det här diagrammet. Men titta på siffran, 27% upp. Inflationen har ju legat någonstans drygt 10, så det här är en ansenlig ökning i livsmedelspriserna. Det ser fortfarande illa ut, även om vi kunde blåsa upp det där diagrammet så skulle vi se att det har skett en viss dipp neråt allra senaste tiden. Boräntorna, där ser ni ökningen. 161% upp. Hälften av LO-hushållen bor i villa, 70% har en bostadsrätt, så att vi är liksom många som tampas med de här bolånen. Så det här ligger ju bakom Alvesta-familjens situation. Hyror och avgifter i flerbostadshus stiger, men de gör ju det med en viss fördröjning. För till skillnad från bostadsrätterna där vi ju väldigt många har rörliga lån eller bundna för en väldigt kort löptid, så är ju hyrorna lite mer långsiktiga. De räknas oftast utifrån de är delvis tillbakablickande, ett genomsnitt för 3-årsperiod. Det är skönt nu när hela ökningen inte har fått genomslag. Det är mindre skönt kommande åren, för att även om räntorna börjar gå ner så kommer den här toppen att släpa med under en tid. Avgifterna räknas också stiga med kanske 10% i genomsnitt, för vissa bostadsrätter betydligt mer. Ställer man frågan till svenska folket, ett stort och representativt urval av svenska folket där vi kan dela upp dem till olika förbundstillhörigheter. Och frågan lyder, hur väl skulle du klara en oförutsedd utgift på 5 000 kronor respektive 50 000 kronor inom en vecka? Alltså skrapa ihop pengar inom en vecka för detta. Så svarar faktiskt 42% av LO-hushållen i den allra senaste mätningen i juni att det är svårt eller omöjligt. Rimligtvis de betydligt fler som har svårt att få ihop 50 000. Det är svårt även för de andra grupperna, men det är ju allra tydligast för LO-familjerna. Och den här siffran har stigit successivt. I decembermätningen var det 30%. Nu är vi uppe på 42%. Att ha jobbet kvar är såklart kanske det viktigaste i detta läge. Arbetsmarknaden har ju varit förvånansvärt motståndskraftig hittills. Vi ser arbetskraftsökningen i den svarta linjen till diagrammet till vänster där. Sysselsättningsökningen med det röda diagrammet. Det har förvånat oss allihopa, som har återspeglat sig också en minskande arbetslöshet fram tills nu. Men när konsumtionsvolymerna störtdyker, när bostadsbyggandet störtdyker, vilket det gör som resultat av de höjda räntorna och det osäkra läget, så vore det ett mirakel om inte det här börjar synas i arbetsmarknaden. Och vi vet vilka grupper är de som löper störst risk för arbetslöshet. Och vad det får för den här tunna ryggen som nu håller uppe och håller hushållen ovanför nollstrecket. Några ord avslutningsvis bara. Hur skulle vi ha mött krisen annorlunda? Det här är mitt favoritdiagram. Det här ska ni fota, det här ska ni sprida, det här ska ni ta med er varenda gång ni hör någon säga från regeringen eller något annat håll: inflationsbekämpning är vårt viktigaste uppgift, därför kan vi inte använda mer av finanspolitiken, mer av statens medel. Så ska ni trycka fram det här diagrammet. Staplarna visar hur de olika europeiska länder har satsat på stöd till hushållen och faktiskt även företag för framförallt elkostnader. 7,5% av BNP i Tyskland, sen fallande skala, den lilla röda pluppen som ni ser där, det är Sverige. Och sen, om den här påståendet stämde att då spär vi på inflationen, hur skulle de här prickarna som är inflation se ut? Tick, 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 eller hur? Gör de det? Nej. Då gör inte det. Den enda korrelation vi kan hitta i det här diagrammet är att de länder som ligger närmast Ryssland, mest beroende av rysk gas, där man fick ett snabbast och kraftigast effekt av de stigande energipriserna, har sett genomsnitt högre inflation. Kom ihåg det här. Om ni ska komma ihåg någonting från Almedalen så vill jag att ni kommer ihåg det här. Man hade kunnat hantera det här mycket bättre. Det har en del andra länder gjort, bland annat Tyskland. Elpriserna här har tillåtits rusa alldeles fritt. Man borde ha gått upp för strömmen, strypt åt dem, gjort åtgärder så att inte det här börjar sprida sig i ekonomin. Det har många andra länder gjort. Det här är superhäftigt då att följa den diskussion som pågår ute i världen, där en del ekonomer var tidigt ute och pekade på det här, blev hånade, offentligt uthängda av såna här gamla giganter, Nobelpristagare och andra. Idag får de ursäkter för det, därför att den här insikten börjar sprida sig, att så här gjorde vi under kriget till exempel. Ströp, gick kanske in och stoppade prisökningarna, kompenserade en del till företagen för att inte låta dem sprida det i ekonomin. Det här behöver man verkligen allvarligt fundera på om vi börjar se nya prisstoppar till vintern som kommer. Slutligen vill jag bara väcka en fråga här. Den här regeringen har ju nu kommit ut med lite aktiv finanspolitik och lite tankar om hur man ska spendera miljarder. Det tänker man lägga på skattesänkningar. Jobbskatteavdrag som består av lite olika delar här. Så har vi plussat ihop och tittat på diagrammet till vänster. Vad är liksom förändring i ekonomisk standard för de olika inkomstgrupperna? Växer stadigt ju högre inkomster. Det som påverkar naturligtvis väldigt mycket är den här utfasningen av jobbskatteavdraget är tänkt att ta bort så att det även gäller för höga inkomster. Det är den stora gråa delen i stapeln till vänster, längst till höger. Är ni med? Yes. Tittar vi på diagrammet till höger, där vi tittar rena pengar. Hur tänker man fördela ut de här 15 miljarderna i jobbskatteavdragsreformer, så är det ganska tydligt vilken grupp som ska få mest. Väcker frågor. Punkt. Tack.
Tack Laura. Marcus, you can just change here with Laura and then we will have all three panelists on stage and going from the conditions to the expectations of households in these times.
Thanks very much, and thank you to everyone for inviting me here, especially to Elo, to Mikael, and to this incredible event that is Almedalen. It's my first time here, and to see a festival of such politics and such ideas that attract so many people is very exciting for me. I want to talk a little bit about political economy and what voters expect. I've worked in politics in the US and Europe for nearly 25 years, and at YouGov as Chief of Public Data, where I run our global research on government, civil society and politics. And I've never seen, in all my years of working in politics or in data, such an appetite for change in the economy as I see now amongst voters everywhere. The data I'll be drawing on is mainly from Western countries, but also from some developing nations as well, over the course of the last year of surveying more than 20 countries. I'll be referencing some of that data as I go, and we'll be making some of this available as a result of new polling next week in a press release. So let's talk about what the economy that the voters want is, and it comes down to three things. They want governments to throw the kitchen sink at solving the cost of living crisis. After that, they want some good full-time jobs. And the third thing is they want an economy that works for everyone, everywhere. And I'll talk about what each of those things mean piece by piece as I go. throwing the kitchen sink at cost of living. Voters understand that the cost of living crisis is tied to inflation, but they don't believe that just because central banks are raising interest rates, that means there's nothing that governments can do about their own cost of living crisis. In fact, it's quite completely the reverse. Expectations of governments are higher than ever as to what action the government should take in all countries that we survey, from Sweden to the United States through to Australia. There's a demand, an instruction by voters of all political persuasions to do more on the cost of living crisis. Indeed, in just the last 9 months of comparative data in Sweden, we looked at this issue at the end of last summer, we look at it at the start of this summer. Support for policies as radical as capping food prices, or capping rents, or cutting gas taxes, or serious tax cuts for low and middle income families has risen phenomenally. It used to be the case that countries like Finland or Sweden were on the low end of nations that we surveyed in terms of support for radical action to cut the cost of living. Now they're right up there with the rest of them, with the UK, with France, with Germany. It's the case that it's very difficult to find a policy that voters won't support that leads to cutting the cost of living. That's how seriously voters are taking this crisis, and they're sending a demand to all governments to do more. The second thing voters want is assuming, and it's a very big assumption, that governments do throw the kitchen sink at solving the cost of living crisis and improving regular conditions for working families. They want something done around good full-time jobs. Now, I know that Sweden's been a little luckier than a lot of your Western economic counterparts in protecting the idea of good full-time jobs. You haven't had quite the bad experience of neoliberal economics that, say, the UK, the US, or Australia has had with the rise of part-time jobs and welfare top-ups in order to make ends meet as those economies. But even in Sweden, we see an expectation that there are still subsectors of the economy where people expect working conditions to improve and they expect wages to go up. And why is that? It's about the dignity of work. It's about respect for the job that you hold, and it's about a wage that means more than just a paycheck. It means something that isn't dependent upon a handout from government in the form of welfare because you're earning enough money in the first place. Understanding the politics of respect that is tied into the politics of work is critical to understanding what the voters expect out of the new economy. It's a core reason why Olaf Scholz won his election. It's a major reason why Joe Biden was able to upset an incumbent president in the United States. Returning to the dignity of work with good full-time jobs in which people have control over their hours to a far greater extent than they currently do, as well as receiving wages that aren't dependent on welfare, is crucial to letting people feel that they have control over their lives and respect for the work that they do. The last thing is an economy that works for everyone everywhere. Now, what do I mean by this? It's really interesting. There's a politics out there and a political economy out there that's being used by election winners around the world. And it's not just the left, it's the right as well. If we look just at the weekend in terms of Mitsotakis' victory with New Democracy in Greece, this was a core part of their offer to the Greek people, which was, we won't just make an economy that works for Athens. We'll make an economy that works for Greek towns and for the Greek countryside as well. We won't just make an economy that works for you if you have a college-educated degree. We'll make an economy that works for you if you have a lower education background. That was also a core part of what Donald Trump was offering the American people in 2016 and blue-collar voters across the Rust Belt. Without that economic offer, he wouldn't have been president. Boris Johnson would not have won a landslide in 2019 in the United Kingdom if it weren't for the fact that he promised to level up the British economy, reducing the regional and local inequalities between areas. And in Norway, I think a big reason why Jonas won in the first place was his ordinary people's turn idea came about with an idea that we could close the gap between lower income and lower education, higher income and higher education, between our towns and our cities. Voters everywhere want a political economy that brings people back together, that makes for one country. And this is the finding that I'll close on because it's so important. In all of those areas, voters are usually willing to say, please give me the nice thing and I don't want to pay a price. They want the extra wage, they want the extra social benefit, they want the extra advantage. But there's no price they're willing to pay. When it comes to closing the gap, though, between regional inequality, between our towns and our cities, lower income, lower education, and the rest, crucial to building an economy that works for everyone, everywhere. Looking forward to the Q&A. Thanks very much.
Marcus, you can stay up here, and Mikael and Laura, you can join. I'm going to start. It's very interesting presentations, and when I hear this, both the expectations on politics and the willing to also sacrifice for the greater good, and what you were showing, Laura, on the material conditions. Why do you think we're not seeing a more active fiscal policy? Michael, do you want to go first?
First of all, it's very strange because I think voters in Sweden are confused. Because in the election campaign, everyone remember what they said. The right-wing parties competed with, we will give you cheaper energy bills from the 1st of November. We will cut the cost of petrol and diesel. We will also, the sausage, it's expensive to be Swedish. That was before the election. After the election, the main message is nothing can be done. That's very strange because it's not the same message before and after the election. So I think it's strange. And I think voters are reacting on this, that they feel a bit tricked by what was said in the election. And I think it is possible to do changes. Fiscal policy in this kind of crisis of cost of living is even more important than other times. Because if you lose out on the fiscal policy, poor people and people with least margin will very much suffer in this time. So I think they've done some mistakes, the government, and they're very passive. And then they hope, doing a political analysis, they want to do an Anders Borg in 2008, saying now we're very strict on the economy and it will eventually lead to good things, and we did it. But this time it's different because people are suffering right now, and also people expect something to be done. Because they saw also how we handled the crisis of the pandemic. It was a different crisis, but we actually handled it, and we tried to do things with political means.
Yeah, and as you say, responsibility has not only in Sweden been synonymous with austerity during this neoliberal regime that we've experienced for 30 years. Laura, what do you think about this current battle on inflation, where fiscal policy, as Michael said, is very passive, central banks are very aggressive, raising interest rates? You were touching upon this in your presentations, how there could have been more strategic reform to cushion the blow for households. How are you positive for the current regime or not?
No, I'm not positive. I'm afraid we're going to see at least 25 points tomorrow, maybe even 50. But to begin with, I think it would be incredibly interesting to do that kind of a survey in Sweden now to see what the voters think today. I think the voters have moved from sort of towards more keeping the country together, even in Sweden. I'm quite sure of that. Whereas the politicians are still in some kind of other corner, where exactly as you say, austerity has been, or responsibility has been the same thing as austerity. First, I think the Riksbank should do differently. I mean, we should not follow the European Central Bank and all the other banks so directly like we do today. The Swedish housing market with big loans is one thing that differs us from Europe. And another thing is, of course, the wage formation as well. We see higher wage increases in many European countries where the European Central Bank now is saying we have to sort of avoid the risk of price wage spirals. That doesn't exist in Sweden. So these two important differences really call for different kind of monetary policy that we basically have the opportunity because we are not in a part of euro, but the Riksbank doesn't use it. Then the other thing is that I'm afraid that my sort of qualified guess is that this government has used this excuse that we are fighting inflation as a way of just waiting out inflation starts decreasing, which it has, and then start introducing its own reforms that are the kind of reforms that I just showed you. So maybe we haven't seen the last reform tax cut yet, or other kind of active fiscal policies that maybe don't go in that direction that I think Sweden needs. But it's been some kind of the decreasing the debt has switched to fighting inflation. There's always an excuse for not being active in fiscal policy, and that's the same as responsibility, and I think that is really important to change.
Marcus, I had a lecture by a colleague of yours in Poland, actually, and they were looking at the Polish people's confidence in central banks or politicians, policymakers in general, on fighting inflations. And the central bank was the one, the chief of the central bank was the one who had least confidence amongst the people on fighting inflation. Are you seeing this in polls in general? People thinking that central banks will solve these rising prices, or are they looking at politicians to solve this cost of living?
Sweden's unusual in that there's more confidence, or rather there's a greater sense in Sweden that the central bank has a responsibility to counter inflation than in a lot of countries. But even there, we've seen that number go down, and the responsibility lies with the government number go up all the time. It used to be, nearly 20 points difference between the two, and now it's less than half a dozen. What we see globally is an expectation that the responsibility for fighting inflation and the responsibility for cutting the cost of living are two sides of the same coin. Now that must be a real headache for economists. But for voters, it's complete common sense. If you are going to do something that makes my life very difficult over here, you need to do at least some things that makes life a little bit more manageable over here. And here's the thing. Voters are actually very sophisticated in their understanding of where this inflation crisis comes from. We gave them lots of different options. We gave them lots of different open boxes where they could write their own responses in their own words as to what it was. And the responses that came back were this. Global supply chains are in trouble. The fallout of the war from Ukraine means food prices have gone up. The long tail of the pandemic means we're all still recovering. The crisis of oil prices from the Gulf and the Saudis' actions. These are voters' responses. They understand how big the structural problems are that are causing global inflation. But here's the thing. The voters understand that if inflation is caused by all of these big global things, how is it on them to solve all of these big global things? How is it that a hit to all of their incomes, how is it a hit to their rents, to their mortgages, to their shopping bills, to their gas bills, to their petrol prices, is going to somehow solve the global supply chain problem or the fallout of the global pandemic? They understand intuitively that there's a cognitive dissonance there. That there's a disconnect between what caused this crisis and the expectation by some governments that they should somehow solve that problem. And as long as voters understand that, you can't expect voters to carry the burden of solving the problem themselves by absorbing an even greater hit on cost of living. If you're going to do structural changes to the core sources of global inflation, you can't expect all of the weight of responsibility to fall on voters' shoulders themselves. If that's the case, the voters are going to be very mad and with some justification.
Are the voters smarter than the economists, Laura?
Maybe in some sense they are. I think you have to understand that this has been quite a challenge for many economists as well. I mean, the mainstream way of thinking a situation where we have inflation is that then we have to have very restrictive economic policy in general. That means both monetary policy, higher interest rates, and restrictive fiscal policy. But now we're in a situation where we don't have an overheated economy at all, vice versa. And the inflation comes from these global shocks and the energy crisis. So this is sort of a new situation, and that's why I referred shortly to the World War II, which is basically the last time when we really were open, both economists and politicians, to these kind of radical ideas. I mean, if you have asked any economist, I got the question last autumn, should we introduce some kind of price ceiling? Well, it takes a lot for an economist to say, yeah, that's a good idea. But now more and more of us are moving into that direction. That's exactly what one of my last slides showed, that these are kind of theories that we have to actually be open to. And these economists are advisors to the politicians. So, of course, this is a sort of a shift in thinking. that takes a while, but until next winter we have to have thought enough so we are more prepared.
And Spain is an example of that, who they put a price ceiling on Russian gas and they shielded their economy from rising energy prices. Mikael, if you look back a year, you were finance minister, you were seeing this prognosis of inflation going up and these scenarios with the Russian invasion of Ukraine. What do you think you could have done differently? Or is there anything that you regret or that you wish that you would have put in place then with all that we know now?
It's a difficult question because it was not that easy to understand what would happen. It was very much talk about very short-term hike of prices. It would go away very fast, and then it's different kind of tools you should use. But I'm pretty disappointed on myself, actually, because I asked some questions about... I had a favorite minister of finance that I met in Europe from Bulgaria. And he had so different ideas than anyone else. He was actually buying up all the fertilizers because they're a big agriculture economy, and he had an idea of actually buying and then selling it cheap, not to inflate the whole agriculture sector of Bulgaria with the energy prices. He also had an idea of lowering energy prices for the production of fertilizers. So actually going in, be very to limit the effect of the high prices of the real economy. And it's harder to see how would we done that in Sweden, but of course we had one thing, the energy prices. And we were a bit kind of bound by finding these 55 billion Swedish crowns at the Svenska Kraftnät that should be paid back. But the regulation of how to use these 55 billion crowns to actually give households back their money was very regulated by the European Union. You could do something, you couldn't do other. We should have used these money to actually lower prices, of course. Some kind of model like the Germans, saying that they're up to this level, you get cheaper prices. Up over there, you have the whole prices. You have the price effects of. I'm a bit disappointed, but I didn't hear that in the debate either. It was no economist that knocked on the door saying we should do like this. So, but in afterward, you have to learn from this. So you have to understand how to handle these kind of crises, and it's relevant for the voters to actually understand how to actually handle a crisis like that. Because it's not because I'm not on exactly the same side as Elo that says that we could pour out much more money in the economy without it getting inflationary.
I will convince him.
Yeah, sometimes perhaps. But I'm not on the same. But on the other hand, there are people that have gained a lot of money, made huge profits. Mm-hmm. And Europe actually agreed that we should take some of the profits from the energy sector. They haven't done anything right. And we should take these profits and put it back to households. Actually, Swedish government was the latest and the worst on this. They didn't manage to do anything. We actually showed in our last budget we could take the profits from the energy sector to put it back in the households' pockets. That I think actually voters would understand and actually respect, that you can use money in the system, but actually in a different way. So I think there's a way of moving. Also, if you have a limited amount of money to actually do the right things and choices.
Be strategic. And I mean, you've put forward a proposition now in opposition to stabilize the energy prices for households. Do you think that this will be picked up by the current government?
No, I don't think so. Folkhem's el. It's a proposal of actually doing for ordinary people what big companies are doing, making long-term agreement on energy supply to lower prices and to put these lower prices out to households. We actually made calculation that could in this winter could have almost halved the energy bills for ordinary households. So you can do things like this. I don't have any expectation on the government to do that. They haven't commented on this proposal either, and they actually haven't even succeeded in convincing the European Union to actually let us use the fees on Svenska Kraftnät next winter. You shouldn't use it the same way as last winter if we have high prices, but you should be able to use the fees. But today we don't have the right to do it. They haven't even prepared so we can use the money if we should need it this winter. This is alarming.
ready for a comeback. Laura, what do you think
Yeah, I
of
mean, this is a really important discussion, but we have to broaden it a bit. I mean, if you're looking into the European countries, there's an interesting difference. In Sweden, we have had an industrial structure in business in general that has actually gained from this kind of energy crisis. We have these technologies for energy effectivization, and green transition has gone long, and so on. So actually the Swedish industrial and business structure has helped us and kept us up as an economy at large, whereas households have gotten very little support from the government. In most European countries, it's the vice versa. So it's a household consumption has been relatively high, much due to these kind of supports that I showed you on my slide, whereas the industry structure has been more difficult. And of course, this is, at general, we might say, well, it doesn't matter as long as the economy copes it, but then you forget about the distributional effects. Because exactly what we see is that prices or profits are kept high in Sweden, and this is actually something that IMF just the other day went out and saying that profits may be the main factor behind the inflation right now. So of course this has huge distributional consequences, which are truly problematic again for exactly those households that we are talking about this seminar.
And Marcus, I think most would agree with the households that the supply shocks and the disruptions in supply chains, the war was the inflationary sort of main push at the beginning of last year. But are households also attributing corporate greed to inflation, as Laura is saying now, that we're seeing now in the data that many of the price surges are actually profits rather than wages or
very much so.
costs.
Like there's an implicit understanding by voters in Sweden. Voters are across a range of 14 countries from the last Global Progress economic survey done with the Center for American Progress that clearly demonstrates an understanding on the part of voters that there are good guys and there are bad guys in this crisis. And the good guys are the voters themselves who are suffering, and the bad guys are the profiteers, the particularly energy companies. Particularly, there's a strong desire across the board, reaching as high as 52% for support for introducing windfall taxes on the excess profits of oil and gas companies that are seen by voters to be profiteering at this time. Like that's one of the areas in which the intuitive understanding that there are heroes and villains in every story kicks in, and the voters know where the villains are, and they don't understand why it is that the villains seem to be getting away with it, whilst the heroes, are suffering so much. And until such a time as governments the world over understand that there needs to be a response that places the proper responsibility where it lies, on the people who are making money out of this crisis, so that the people who are suffering in this crisis can find some relief, governments will find themselves on the wrong side of public opinion there. And this is really important to understand, because it's very different from what we're used to in terms of traditional right-left economic debates. Usually the right is able to say, we're all in this together, this is going to be very tough, short-term pain for long-term gain. Those are the standard arguments that right-wing governments make during times of economic pain. In this crisis, we're seeing no effect with those arguments whatsoever. Instead, we're seeing a clear rejection of those arguments on the part of voters, whether their government is left or right-wing, and even whether they themselves voted for the left or the right, because they're saying, this is different. I didn't cause this problem. I'm not part of this crisis, and I expect you to do something about it that helps me, that doesn't hurt me. And that instruction from voters is going to come through clear, loud and clear, every time they have a chance to vote, until such a time as governments actually respond accordingly.
And what do you all three think the response should be then for corporate profits rising in this crisis, or profiteers as you called them, Marcus? Could fiscal policy do anything about this, or should you just play on the moral high ground and hope that the companies will lower their prices to be nice?
I actually think that the single most effective thing that this government has done thus far is when the Minister of Finance called the three big so-called matjättarna to a meeting and then told them that if you're not gonna do something about it and stop increasing your prices so
On
much,
food,
food prices, something will happen. I don't even know exactly what she could threaten with, but this kind of political leadership and communication, I think, has been it's not enough, but it is definitely something that works and has had an impact, at least what we can see to the data. And then, of course, you have to see over that the competition works properly. There are reports coming only last week from the Konkurrensverket, whatever that's called in English, looking into following the price of eggs from the producer to the grocery and seeing the producers are not the ones getting the prices. I mean, the producer price index went down for the first time now, the last time, only a couple of days ago when we got the new figures. So there's definitely more to do with those kind of issues. But then we have to also look at this exactly where we started, the ways of stopping the energy price, the original shock that hits the economy, to do something like the Bulgarian, at least be open to that kind of measures.
What do you think, Mikael?
I think it's very easy to get prices going up fast. It's much slower often to get the price down, because the incentives for that is not that clear, those who make the profit. So I think on the food side, we proposed a price commission. We actually used it earlier in Swedish history, so actually put pressure on all part of the chain to see that the lower costs of producing actually transforms to lower prices in the stores. I think that's a way to push pressure. We actually just the other week agreed with some other parties to give this. We have one bank actually that's owned by the state, to actually give them the objective to actually increase competition when it comes to interest rates on the banking sector, because the banks are doing huge profits and there's not that much competition on this side. So the state bank can play a part to actually see to it that this transformation actually happens, because the banks was very fast in increasing the interest rates on mortgages, but on your saving accounts they have not been as fast as increasing the rents. So I think that's things you can do, but on the other side also look at the profit margins of the energy sector. If there are still this winter very huge profits, some of that profit should be brought back to ordinary households. I think it's clear.
Actually, these are more or less the direct ways of affecting prices, but there are at least two areas where you could really do much more on fiscal policy and actually take away the bottlenecks and ease up the pressure for inflation in the economy. One is, of course, all kind of energy investments, energy effectivization, energy investments, and energy production. And the other thing is, of course, labor markets. We have all too low levels of active labor market policies and all kind of vocational training within the regular educational system and within labor market policies now. So that's crazy, because we have a labor market that is totally divided. We have places, parts of Sweden where there's really the economy is hot and there are lots of vacancies, and we still have a high unemployment. So by introducing much more of these active labor market policies, we could actually, again, reduce these potential bottlenecks that might lead to wage pressure and that wise more inflation.
Yeah, I just want to underline that, because those are exactly the kind of things that help bring your country back together.
Yeah.
That you address the economic problems that are leading to division within your countries when you do vocational education, when you do regional investment, when you do an understanding that you don't need to have a graduate and a postgraduate degree to be successful in an economy. The support for those policies and for an education, jobs and training program amongst that is absolutely clear, again, across the board.
And I would just like to do a little bit experiment. If we would imagine that the war on Ukraine had never been started by Russia, if we would have returned to normal after the pandemic. Philip Lane, who is chief economist at the ECB, has said we haven't seen normal in Europe in a long time, and words such as polycrisis, permacrisis are used to describe this current situation with geopolitical tensions, climate change, cost of living, and income gaps. But how different do you think the political conflicts would be if we would have stand here today without the war on Ukraine? What would be different in the political debate? Or are we just seeing these problems more clearly when we have a war or a crisis like we have now?
It's a difficult question, I think. So always hard to understand where we were. But I think without the cost crisis in Sweden, we would have a much more optimistic population, because we were heading to a very interesting development in industry, regional development, increased investments. The green transition in Sweden were about to become a success story for everyone. This was the future of Sweden being built in cities that haven't seen that growth in quite a time. But then the cost of living crisis hit the electors on gasoline, on petrol, on energy price. People were afraid. Perhaps this green transition are the one that create the cost crisis. Instead of the different argument, let's invest in the energy sector to actually cope with these cost developments and create more jobs and investments. So I think we would have a much more optimistic view. I think Sweden were about to become the very much an example of how to do the green transition in a different way, and also with the agreement on the labor market to actually have the possibilities in the future to take a year off actually to study and transform your education in midlife. No other countries have that kind of support scheme. That would be a kind of game changer for Sweden competitiveness going forward. Now the government is creating problems also for this, but that's a totally different story. Yeah. I think we were getting a very positive momentum, but now we have to fight two battles, the future and here and now.
And bearing that in mind, Laura and Marcus, do you think the possibilities for progressive fiscal policy are greater or less great with this more pessimistic population,
I think and I hope, but I definitely both hope and think that there is more and more willingness and pressure to actually do more things. And I also see with this government, I mean, it's quite fantastic how much regulation and state intervention it's willing to do, even though it's maybe on other areas than the kind of progressive welfare labor market areas that we would like to see. So I definitely hope. Then I must be dull and moderate and conservative researcher to say that I spent my 10-15 years in the academia to develop methods to really isolate the effect of things and to understand what the counterfactual state would have been, and that's difficult. What I learned is that there are very few things that are exogenous. Why am I saying all this, mumbo jumbo? That's because I think that the war was not an exogenous shock. It's sort of a consequence of things that happened also, and geopolitical tensions that we see in the world in general. So even if Russia hadn't gone into Ukraine in February last year, we might have seen something else. We might have seen something worse. So I'm not the right one to just
so what you're
get
saying
here
is,
where we would have been without the war.
And so what you're saying is also that these risks are there even if there would be peace in Ukraine.
I think I'm
Marcus, what
sure
would you?
Yeah, I want to pick up on what Mikael was saying about how the temperament of the Ukraine crisis amongst voters has changed, even potentially around the environment. Like, I do think just 3 years ago there was far more optimism around green transition and around the politics of a green transition than there is now. Now voters, especially lower income, lower education voters, when they hear green, they're more likely to reach for their wallet. Nearly 4 out of 10 voters think that a net zero will only be possible if their cost of living increases. That's a real change from 5 years ago when they thought that you could have their cake and eat it too. They could have a good cost of living. They could have net zero without increases to their own cost of living. This is really important for governments and for parties and for activists who are passionate about climate change to understand. If you want to win arguments on the environment, you need to lead with the economy first. That doesn't mean you don't make an argument about the environment. It doesn't mean you abandon your green ambitions. It means you make your arguments for the environment in the context of how that makes things better for people's lives and better for people's bills and better for people's costs of living. If you do that, there's still very clear support for green policies. But if you lead instead with the purely environmental argument, or with environment first, economy second, you lose that support very quickly. That is a change since the Ukraine war. Causality notwithstanding, I would say that it's best to just mark that change and adapt accordingly. And when making your arguments around the environment, don't abandon them. Just lead with the economy first, and how being smart on the green economy is good for their bills, good for their cost of living.
And of course, there's a lot of environmental policies that would actually shield us from price shocks on oil and gas.
Absolutely.
We have time for one quick question from the audience, and you were quick here.
Thank you. Is it on? Yeah. If you were like all three of you, Minister of Finance for one day, and if we are talking about the pressure on the households, what's the first thing you would do to easing the burden in a responsible way?
You stole my last question. So we can have one more from the audience. Is there anyone else that want to ask a question? So spare that one for last. No, all right. Well, let's end on that. And Marcus, you will go first, and then Laura and Michael.
I'd cut taxes. And I'd cut taxes not necessarily because that's the smartest thing you can do economically, but sometimes the right thing to do is the thing that the voter really wants you and needs you to do. And that's not because you're pandering to voters, it's because you're respecting them. You're saying, like, you understand the circumstances that you're in, you understand how difficult it is right now, you understand what it is that you need. And if you're telling me that what you really need is a targeted tax cut, I'm not saying for the rich, I'm saying for low and middle income families, then that makes a big difference. That's what I do. And the reason why I do it is also because it's a sign of fundamental respect. It's appreciating that voters might actually, after all, be the ones who do understand their own individual economic circumstances, and we should respect that and we should respond to it accordingly. Sometimes you have to do not what is the perfect thing economically, but the right thing personally for voters in order to win back that trust. Because without that trust, you can't do anything else.
But aren't the UK voters also very discontent with the cuts in the NHS and other social benefits that are financed by taxes?
I think that, as is very clear by the choices that governments have made, especially right-wing governments in power, you can roll back tax cuts on the wealthiest to pay for tax cuts for those who are most in need without any actual net change in your fiscal position. It's not a question of having to say either we cut our health spending or you have some relief at home. It's actually a question of priorities.
All right. All right. Thank you. Laura?
I would not cut taxes. I would actually, if I would do anything with taxes, I would hire them for the capital in different ways. I would make first the decision that we actually can lower now I don't know the word in English, but överskottsmål. I would decide that we can actually spend more for years ahead.
Okay, yeah.
That would be my first decision. Then I would use the tax that I gather to finance the welfare sector. That is not incredibly important also for the households to feel safe with the schooling, with the preschooling, with the elderly care and all the services that the welfare sector provides. Also makes it easier to go to work, feeling sure that your kids and your old mother is taken care of in the caring system. And then I would do, of course, direct my support, especially to the families, child support, the lowest levels for different kind of social security, and so on. So I would direct
that's what you have in time for, I think, in one
Yes.
day as finance minister. What do you say, Mikael?
No, but I would argue that we have to do two things right now in this crisis, because we have talked about the cost of crisis of household, but we have a cost of crisis on the welfare system, as the schooling system and the educational and the healthcare system. So you have to now, if the government are not doing this in the next budget, you will have chaos in the healthcare sector. We already see that almost every region have deficits already. So you have to manage that. But if you manage that, you cannot lose sight of the wallet of people. And looking at the wallet of people, you actually see, if you have a very targeted, I would say the single moms and single dads, because they are really suffering right now, and they don't have any other choices. I think I would concentrate on that, but if I were very limited, I would do that.
Thank you, Mikael, and I thank you for listening. And I know that there's some gifts from the party to you panelists for this great participation. Ooh, it's skorpor.
Thank you.
Amazing.
Thank you very much.
Chocolate biscuits.
This is not helpful.
All right, thank you
Tack.
so much, and
Thank you
thank
very
you
much.
for listening.
Nice meeting. I have to
Real
run.
pleasure.